They called me the quiet one who would never amount to anything in business. But that day when Dad came to my office with tears in his eyes, begging me to save the company my sister had destroyed, everything changed. The mahogany desk between us seemed to shrink as I watched this titan of industry, the man who had built an empire from nothing, reduced to pleading with the child he had written off years ago. The irony wasn't lost on me as I sat in my corner office on the 42nd floor, surrounded by awards and testimonials from Fortune 500 companies I had saved from bankruptcy, while he finally saw what had been right in front of him all along. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the room, and for the first time in my life, I held all the power in our relationship. Before I share this story with you, I want to know you are here with me. Just say listening in the comments, or let me know where you are in the world. I love hearing how far these stories of hidden strength reach, and yours might be the next one that needs to be told. Growing up in the Morrison family meant living in the shadow of Morrison Industries, the manufacturing empire my father built with his bare hands and relentless determination. Every dinner conversation revolved around quarterly reports. Every family vacation was planned around board meetings, and every milestone in our lives was measured against the company's success. Dad would sit at the head of our dining room table, still wearing his suit at 8 in the evening, talking about profit margins and market expansion while Mom served pot roast and tried to keep the conversation light. My sister Sarah would hang on every word, asking questions about hostile takeovers and corporate strategy, her eyes bright with ambition and the certainty that she was born to inherit his throne. I would sit quietly, absorbing every detail but never speaking up, already labeled as the dreamer, the one who preferred books to boardrooms. Sarah was everything Dad thought a business leader should be. She was loud where I was quiet, aggressive where I was thoughtful, and commanding where I was observant. She had this way of walking into a room and immediately becoming the center of attention, her laugh echoing off the walls as she regaled whoever would listen with stories of her latest triumph at business school. Dad would beam with pride as she outlined her vision for expanding the company into international markets, her hands gesturing wildly as she painted pictures of Morrison Industries becoming a global powerhouse. The family gatherings became Sarah's stage, and she performed beautifully, discussing merger opportunities and competitive advantages with the confidence of someone who had never doubted their place in the world. I learned early to find my value in different ways. While Sarah networked at country club events and student business competitions, I spent my time in the university library, devouring case studies of companies that had faced impossible challenges and somehow survived. I became fascinated by the quiet heroes of the business world, the consultants and strategists who worked behind the scenes to turn failing enterprises into success stories. My professors noticed my analytical mind and my ability to see patterns that others missed, but at home, these skills were invisible against Sarah's flashy presentations and bold declarations. The summer before my senior year, Dad offered both of us internships at Morrison Industries. Sarah was placed in the executive training program, shadowing senior vice presidents and attending high-level strategy meetings. I was assigned to the accounting department, buried in spreadsheets and financial reports that most people found tedious. Dad explained it as giving me exposure to the nuts and bolts of the business, but I knew it was really about keeping me busy while Sarah learned the important stuff. What he didn't realize was that those months in accounting taught me to read a company's health in ways that executive training never could. I learned to spot the warning signs of financial trouble months before they became crisis, to identify inefficiencies that were bleeding money from operations, and to understand the delicate balance between growth and sustainability. While Sarah was learning how to make impressive presentations, I was learning how to save companies from themselves. The senior accountants, grateful for someone who actually listened to their concerns, began sharing insights about industry trends and competitor weaknesses that never made it to the executive floor. They taught me that the real story of any business was written in the numbers, not in the glossy reports prepared for board meetings. After graduation, Sarah immediately joined Morrison Industries as a junior executive, her path to leadership clearly mapped out and celebrated. I took what everyone saw as the lesser option, accepting a position with a small consulting firm that specialized in corporate turnarounds. Dad shook his head when I announced my decision, asking why I wanted to work for strangers when I could be building the family legacy. Sarah was more direct, calling it a waste of my MBA and suggesting that I was afraid of real responsibility. The family narrative was set. Sarah was the heir apparent while I was the one who chose the easy path. What they didn't know was that my small consulting firm handled some of the most challenging cases in the industry. While Sarah was learning Morrison Industries' established systems, I was being thrown into companies on the verge of bankruptcy, family businesses torn apart by succession disputes, and manufacturing operations crippled by foreign competition. Every day brought a new crisis that required immediate analysis and creative solutions. I learned to work under pressure that would have crushed most people, to find opportunities in situations that looked hopeless, and to communicate complex strategies to desperate business owners who needed results, not theories. My first major case involved a textile company that had lost 60% of its contracts to overseas competitors. The owner, a third-generation businessman named Frank, was 3 months away from closing doors and laying off 200 employees who had worked for his family for decades. I spent 2 weeks analyzing every aspect of his operation, from supply chain costs to employee productivity, and discovered that his company's strength wasn't in competing on price, but in providing specialized services that required quick turnarounds and personal attention. We pivoted the entire business model, focusing on custom orders and rush jobs that the overseas manufacturers couldn't handle efficiently. Within 6 months, Frank's company was not only profitable again, but expanding into new markets. He sent me a handwritten letter thanking me for saving not just his business, but his family's legacy, and he began referring other struggling manufacturers to our firm. Word spread quickly in the industry about the young consultant who could find solutions where others saw only problems. My reputation grew quietly but steadily, built on results rather than self-promotion, and soon I was handling cases across multiple industries. The pattern repeated itself over and over. A family restaurant chain facing bankruptcy after a failed expansion became profitable again when I helped them return to their core strengths while streamlining operations. A technology startup burning through investor money learned to balance innovation with financial discipline and eventually sold for $40 million. A construction company struggling with union disputes and cost overruns became the most efficient operation in their region after implementing the management systems I designed. Each success brought new challenges and opportunities. Corporate executives who had watched me turn around their competitors began reaching out quietly, asking for confidential consultations on their own problems. I learned to navigate the delicate politics of family businesses, to mediate between generations of owners who couldn't agree on direction, and to implement changes that preserve company culture while improving performance. My client list grew to include names that would have impressed even Dad, but I kept my work confidential, honoring the trust that desperate business owners placed in me. Meanwhile, Sarah's career at Morrison Industries progressed exactly as everyone expected. She moved through various departments, learning the systems and building relationships with key employees. Dad proudly announced each promotion at family dinners, describing her latest achievements and the leadership skills she was developing. Sarah would update us on her projects, always framing them in terms of growth and expansion, painting pictures of Morrison Industries dominating new markets and crushing competitors. I listened to these updates with growing concern, not because Sarah lacked intelligence or ambition, but because her approach to business relied too heavily on aggressive growth without adequate attention to operational stability. During one family dinner, she excitedly described her plan to double production capacity by acquiring a struggling competitor, explaining how Morrison Industries could absorb their market share and eliminate a threat simultaneously. Her enthusiasm was infectious, and Dad beamed with pride as she outlined the financial projections and expansion timeline. But I had seen similar strategies fail catastrophically in my consulting work. Companies that focused on rapid acquisition without properly integrating operations often found themselves overextended and vulnerable to market downturns. The struggling competitor Sarah wanted to acquire wasn't struggle. ING because of bad luck or poor market conditions. They were struggling because of fundamental operational problems that would become Morrison Industries' problems the moment the acquisition was complete. I tried to raise these concerns delicately, suggesting that maybe a slower, more careful approach might be safer. Sarah dismissed my concerns with a laugh, pointing out that I worked for a small consulting firm while she was learning from actual industry leaders. Dad supported her position, explaining that calculated risks were necessary for growth and that playing it safe was how companies got left behind by more aggressive competitors. The message was clear, my caution was seen as fear, and my experience with failing companies was viewed as evidence of my limited perspective rather than valuable insight. I stopped offering unsolicited advice and focused on building my own career. My consulting firm promoted me to senior partner after just 3 years, recognizing my track record of successful turnarounds and my ability to attract high-profile clients. I was invited to speak at industry conferences, write articles for business journals, and serve on advisory boards for companies in various sectors. My income surpassed what I would have earned at Morrison Industries, and my professional reputation extended far beyond the manufacturing sector that had defined my family's world. The recognition felt good, but it also highlighted the strange parallel universe I was living in. At work and in professional settings, I was respected as an expert whose opinion carried weight and whose strategies delivered results. At family gatherings, I was still the quiet one who had chosen the safer path, whose modest consulting work couldn't compare to Sarah's executive responsibilities. The contrast became more pronounced as years passed, and I found myself living two completely different identities. My personal life reflected this split existence. I dated people who knew me through my professional work, who understood my expertise and appreciated my analytical mind. But I rarely brought them to family events, knowing that my family's perception of my career would color their impression of who I was. I bought a beautiful townhouse in the city, furnished it with art and books that reflected my tastes, and created a space where I could be fully myself. Yet I never invited my family to visit, not wanting to explain why my lifestyle didn't match their expectations of someone in my supposed position. The years passed, and Sarah's influence at Morrison Industries grew stronger. Dad began including her in major strategic decisions, and industry publications started mentioning her as a rising star in manufacturing leadership. She handled the attention gracefully, giving interviews about the next generation of business leaders and the importance of innovation in traditional industries. Her confidence was genuine and well-earned. She had learned the business thoroughly and had contributed to several successful projects that had expanded Morrison Industries' market presence. But I continued to notice warning signs that apparently no one else saw. Morrison Industries' debt-to-equity ratio was climbing as they funded expansion projects. Their inventory turnover was slowing as they tried to serve too many different markets, and their profit margins were shrinking as they competed on price rather than value. These weren't crisis-level problems yet, but they represented dangerous trends that could accelerate quickly if market conditions changed or if a major decision went wrong. During one family dinner, Sarah announced that Dad was preparing to name her as his successor within the next year. The decision wasn't unexpected, but hearing it stated so definitively made it real in a way that years of assumption hadn't. Dad explained that he wanted to step back gradually, maintaining advisory oversight while Sarah took operational control of the company. He spoke about preserving the family legacy and ensuring that Morrison Industries continued to grow and prosper for future generations. I felt a complex mix of emotions as I listened to the announcement. Part of me was genuinely happy for Sarah, who had worked hard and earned the opportunity to lead. Another part felt the familiar sting of being overlooked, of having my potential dismissed before it was ever truly tested. But the strongest emotion was worry, a deep concern that Sarah's aggressive growth strategies were setting Morrison Industries up for serious problems that could threaten everything Dad had built. The succession plan was announced publicly at Morrison Industries' annual shareholder meeting, with Sarah presenting her vision for the company's future. She spoke confidently about expanding into new markets, modernizing production facilities, and positioning Morrison Industries as a leader in innovative manufacturing solutions. The presentation was polished and impressive, and the shareholders responded with enthusiasm and strong applause. I attended the meeting as a family member, sitting in the back and watching Sarah command the room with the same confidence she had shown since childhood. Dad sat in the front row, ing with pride as his chosen successor outlined plans that would transform his company into something bigger and more ambitious than he had ever imagined. The local business press covered the event extensively, praising Sarah's leadership potential and Morrison Industries' bright future under new management. What struck me most about Sarah's presentation was how closely it resembled the aggressive expansion strategies I had seen fail in my consulting work. The timeline was ambitious to the point of being unrealistic. The financial projections assumed perfect market conditions and flawless execution. And the operational changes required coordination across multiple departments that had never worked together at that scale before. It was exactly the kind of plan that looked brilliant in a boardroom, but fell apart when confronted with real-world complications. After the meeting, family and friends gathered for a celebration dinner at the country club. Sarah was the center of attention, accepting congratulations and answering questions about her plans with the enthusiasm of someone who genuinely believed she was about to change the world. Dad made a speech about passing the torch to the next generation and his confidence that Sarah would take Morrison Industries to heights he had never imagined possible. I sat at a side table with some family friends, making polite conversation and trying to ignore the growing sense of dread in my stomach. Everything about the evening felt like a celebration of impending disaster, but I was the only one who seemed to see it coming. When people asked about my work, I gave vague answers about helping companies improve their operations, downplaying the scope and success of my consulting practice to avoid awkward questions about why I wasn't involved in the family business. The transition period began immediately, with Sarah taking on increasing responsibility while Dad maintained final approval on major decisions. She threw herself into the role with characteristic energy, implementing new systems and launching projects that had been discussed for years but never executed. The changes were dramatic and visible, from updated technology systems to revised marketing strategies that positioned Morrison Industries as a forward-thinking leader in their industry. For the first few months, everything seemed to validate Sarah's approach. Sales increased, new contracts were signed, and industry analysts praised Morrison Industries' aggressive modernization efforts. Sarah was featured on magazine covers and invited to speak at conferences about the future of American manufacturing. Dad's pride was obvious every time he talked about her success, and family dinners became celebrations of her latest achievements. But I continued to monitor the situation through industry publications and financial reports, and the trends that worried me were accelerating. Morrison Industries' expenses were growing faster than their revenue. Their debt service was consuming an increasing percentage of their cash flow, and their inventory levels were rising as production outpaced actual demand. Sarah's aggressive timeline was putting pressure on every department to deliver results quickly, leading to shortcuts and inefficiencies that were invisible in the short term but would compound over time. The warning signs became impossible to ignore when Morrison Industries announced their acquisition of Hartwell Manufacturing, the struggling competitor Sarah had identified years earlier. The purchase price was steep, requiring Morrison Industries to take on significant additional debt, but Sarah positioned it as a strategic move that would eliminate a competitor while expanding their production capacity and market reach. The business press covered the acquisition positively, describing it as a bold move that demonstrated Morrison Industries' confidence in their growth strategy. I knew from my consulting experience that Hartwell Manufacturing's problems ran deeper than market conditions or temporary setbacks. They had fundamental operational issues, including outdated equipment, inefficient workflows, and a demoralized workforce that had been dealing with uncertainty for years. Acquiring those problems wouldn't make them disappear. It would make them Morrison Industries' responsibility, while adding the complexity of integrating two different company cultures and systems. The acquisition closed on a Friday in early March, and Sarah called to invite me to a celebration dinner that weekend. Her excitement was genuine and infectious. She truly believed that she had just made the deal that would secure Morrison Industries' future and cement her reputation as a visionary leader. I accepted the invitation, hoping that my concerns were unfounded and that maybe Sarah's confidence was based on information I didn't have access to. The dinner was held at the same country club where we had celebrated Sarah's succession announcement, but the atmosphere was different now. Instead of looking toward the future, Sarah was focused on the immediate challenges of integrating Hartwell Manufacturing into Morrison Industries operations. She talked about the complexities of merging two production systems, the difficulties of coordinating logistics across multiple facilities, and the cultural differences between workforces that had been competitors for decades. As I listened to Sarah describe the integration challenges, I realized that she was beginning to understand the magnitude of what she had taken on. The problems I had anticipated were already materializing, from equipment failures at the newly acquired facility to scheduling conflicts that were disrupting both companies' operations. Sarah was handling the stress with characteristic determination, but I could see the strain in her eyes and hear it in her voice when she thought no one was paying attention. The months following the acquisition were marked by increasingly frequent crisis management sessions, as Sarah and her team struggled to address problems that seemed to multiply faster than they could be solved. Production delays affected customer relationships, cost overruns consumed the projected savings from the acquisition, and employee morale suffered as people worked longer hours to compensate for systematic inefficiencies. Morrison Industries' financial performance began to reflect these operational struggles, with quarterly reports showing declining profitability despite increased revenue. Dad remained publicly supportive of Sarah's leadership, but I noticed subtle changes in his demeanor during family gatherings. He asked more detailed questions about specific challenges, offered suggestions based on his own experience with difficult business decisions, and sometimes seemed frustrated when Sarah defended strategies that weren't producing the expected results. The dynamic between them shifted from celebration of her success to collaboration on problem-solving, then gradually towards something that looked more like concern. The crisis that would change everything began with what should have been a routine decision about production scheduling. Morrison Industries had landed a major contract with a new client, the kind of deal that Sarah had been pursuing as part of her growth strategy. The contract required producing a large quantity of specialized components within an aggressive timeline, exactly the type of challenging project that was supposed to demonstrate Morrison Industries' expanded capabilities after the Hartwell acquisition. Sarah committed to the timeline without fully accounting for the integration problems that were still affecting both facilities. The production schedule required perfect coordination between teams that were still learning to work together, using equipment that hadn't been fully integrated into Morrison Industries' maintenance systems, and meeting quality standards that required more oversight than anyone anticipated. When the first production runs failed to meet specifications, Sarah authorized expensive overtime and expedited material orders to get back on schedule. The problems cascaded from there, with each attempted solution creating new complications that required additional resources and attention. Component quality remained inconsistent, Delivery deadlines kept slipping, and the client became increasingly frustrated with Morrison Industries' inability to deliver what they had promised. Sarah worked 18-hour days trying to salvage the contract, bringing in additional consultants and authorizing expenditures that consumed the project's entire profit margin and then some. By the time it became clear that the contract couldn't be fulfilled as originally negotiated, Morrison Industries had invested nearly $10 million in a project that would generate less than $4 million in revenue. The client canceled the remaining portion of the contract and demanded penalty payments for delays that had disrupted their own production schedule. Sarah was forced to write off the entire investment while simultaneously paying damages that pushed the total loss to over $10 million. The magnitude of the loss sent shockwaves through Morrison Industries and the broader manufacturing community. Industry analysts questioned Morrison Industries' risk management practices and Sarah's decision-making process, while competitors began approaching Morrison Industries' other clients with offers to provide more reliable service. Dad was forced to step back into active management to reassure employees and stakeholders that the company would weather the crisis. But privately, he was devastated by how quickly decades of careful growth had been threatened by a single failed project. Sarah accepted full responsibility for the disaster, but the damage to her confidence and reputation was severe. She had built her leadership identity around her ability to make bold decisions and deliver dramatic results, and the failure of her most ambitious project called all of that into question. The stress was visible in everything from her appearance to her communication style, as the person who had always radiated confidence now seemed uncertain and defensive. Family dinners became tense affairs, with Dad asking pointed questions about Morrison Industries' recovery strategy, while Sarah struggled to present plans that would restore profitability without acknowledging that her fundamental approach might be wrong. I wanted to help, but I also knew that any advice I offered would be seen as criticism from someone who had never faced challenges of this magnitude. The family dynamic that had always positioned me as the cautious observer made it impossible for me to contribute meaningfully to conversations about solutions. The final blow came when Morrison Industries Bank demanded immediate action to address their deteriorating debt-to-equity ratio. The $10 million loss had pushed the company's finances beyond the comfort zone of their lending partners, who were now requiring either significant additional collateral or fundamental changes to the business strategy that had created the problem. Sarah was forced to admit that she didn't have solutions that would satisfy the bank's requirements while maintaining the growth trajectory she had promised to shareholders and employees. That was when Dad finally swallowed his pride and decided to seek help from the child he had always seen as playing it safe in the business world. He called my office on a Tuesday morning in late November, his voice carefully controlled as he asked if I had time to discuss a consulting opportunity. I knew immediately that something was seriously wrong, because Dad had never acknowledged my consulting work as anything more than a hobby that kept me busy between real opportunities. We arranged to meet at my office that afternoon, and I spent the intervening hours preparing for a conversation I had been both dreading and anticipating for years. This was the moment when the parallel universes of my professional success and family perception would finally collide, when Dad would have to reconcile his image of me as the cautious underachiever with the reality of my expertise and track record. I had no idea whether this meeting would finally bring us together or drive us even further apart. The elevator ride to my office felt like the longest 42 floors of my life, knowing that Dad was coming to me not as his child, but as a potential solution to a crisis that threatened everything he had built. I stood by my office windows, watching the city spread out below, and reflected on the journey that had brought me to this moment. While my family had seen me as the safe choice, the one who avoided real challenges, I had actually been fighting battles they couldn't imagine, saving companies from disasters that would have destroyed lesser leaders. My consulting career had begun with that textile company, But what my family never learned was how that success had opened doors to increasingly complex and high-stakes situations. After Frank's company became profitable again, he introduced me to his banker, who had been watching several of his clients struggle with similar challenges. Within 6 months, I was consulting for a network of small manufacturers across 3 states, each facing unique problems, but all requiring the same fundamental approach of careful analysis followed by decisive action. The breakthrough case that established my reputation came during my second year, when a family-owned steel fabrication company was 3 weeks away from bankruptcy. For generations of the Kowalski family had built their business on quality and relationships, but foreign competition and changing markets had left them struggling to compete on price while maintaining the standards that had defined their reputation. The family was divided on strategy, with older members wanting to focus on their traditional strengths while younger voices pushed for dramatic modernization that would require massive investment. I spent 10 days analyzing every aspect of their operation, from their supplier relationships to their employee skill sets, and discovered that their real competitive advantage wasn't in manufacturing standard components, but in their ability to solve complex custom fabrication problems that larger companies couldn't handle efficiently. The Kowalski family had accumulated decades of specialized knowledge about working with difficult materials and unusual specifications, knowledge that was incredibly valuable to certain types of clients but invisible to the broader market. We completely restructured their business model, focusing on high-value custom work that required their unique expertise while gradually phasing out the commodity products that were losing money. The transformation required retraining some employees, investing in specialized equipment, and developing new marketing strategies that emphasized their problem-solving capabilities rather than their production capacity. Within 18 months, the Kowalski company was not only profitable, but commanding premium prices for work that their competitors couldn't do. The success of the Kowalski turnaround attracted attention from larger companies facing similar challenges, and soon I was consulting for businesses with revenues in the hundreds of millions rather than the tens of millions I had been working with previously. Each case taught me something new about the patterns that led to business failure and the strategies that could reverse even seemingly hopeless situations. I learned to recognize the warning signs months before they became visible to traditional financial analysis, and I developed frameworks for implementing complex changes without disrupting the core operations that kept companies alive during transition periods. My reputation spread quietly through networks of business owners, bankers, and industry associations who dealt with struggling companies on a regular basis. I never advertised my services or sought publicity, but word traveled quickly when desperate business owners found solutions they hadn't thought possible. The referral network grew stronger with each successful turnaround, creating a steady stream of challenging cases that pushed me to develop new skills and strategies. One of the most demanding projects involved a technology company that had grown too fast and lost control of both their costs and their product quality. The founder had built the company from a startup to $50 million in annual revenue in just 4 years, but rapid growth had created systemic problems that threatened to destroy everything he had accomplished. The company was burning through cash at an unsustainable rate, customer complaints were increasing as product quality declined, and key employees were leaving for more stable opportunities. The founder, a brilliant engineer named David Chun, had lost confidence in his own decision-making after watching his dream company spiral toward failure. He had tried bringing in traditional management consultants, but their generic recommendations hadn't addressed the unique challenges of his situation. When he called me, he was 2 months away from running out of cash and facing the possibility of laying off employees who had believed in his vision enough to take significant pay cuts to join his company. Working with David's company required me to learn an entirely new industry while simultaneously implementing changes that would stabilize operations and restore confidence among employees and customers. I spent 3 weeks analyzing their development processes, customer service systems, and financial controls, identifying dozens of inefficiencies that were collectively costing them millions of dollars annually. The solutions weren't complicated individually, but implementing them required coordinating changes across multiple departments while maintaining the innovation culture that had made the company successful in the first place. The turnaround took 8 months of intensive work, during which I practiced. Callie lived at David's company, working alongside employees to redesign workflows, establish quality control systems, and create financial reporting structures that gave management real-time visibility into their operations. We had to rebuild customer relationships that had been damaged by quality PR. Problems, restructure supplier agreements to improve cost controls, and implement project management systems that prevented the chaos that had previously characterized their development process. The transformation was so successful that David's company was acquired by a Fortune 500 corporation for $80 million just 2 years after they had been on the verge of bankruptcy. David insisted on including a substantial bonus in my consulting fee, explaining that I had saved not just his company, but his personal reputation and the livelihoods of 60 employees who had trusted him with their careers. The acquisition made industry news, and several articles mentioned the remarkable turnaround that had made the company attractive to such a large buyer. That success opened doors to even more challenging situations, including family businesses torn apart by succession disputes, manufacturing companies struggling with union negotiations, and technology firms facing patent litigation that threatened their survival. Each case required me to become an expert in new industries and master complex problems that had no standard solutions. I developed a reputation for taking on the impossible cases, the situations where other consultants had failed and business owners had given up hope. The work was demanding and often stressful, but it was also incredibly rewarding to see companies and families that had been facing disaster find new life and prosperity. I learned to navigate delicate family dynamics where business decisions were complicated by decades of personal relationships, to mediate between stakeholders with conflicting interests, and to implement changes that preserved what was valuable about company cultures while eliminating the practices that were causing problems. My client list grew to include names that would have impressed anyone in the business world, from multi-generational family enterprises to cutting-edge technology companies to traditional manufacturers facing existential challenges from changing markets. I worked with companies across the country, traveling constantly and immersing myself in different industries and regional business cultures. The consulting firm promoted me to senior partner and eventually offered me an ownership stake, recognizing that my track record was bringing in clients and revenue far beyond what they had achieved previously. During these same years, I watched Sarah's career at Morrison Industries progress exactly as everyone had predicted. She moved through various departments, learning the business and building relationships with employees and industry partners. Her natural charisma made her popular with workers and customers alike, and her genuine enthusiasm for the company's mission created loyalty and excitement about Morrison Industries' future. Dad was clearly grooming her for leadership, and she embraced the responsibility with characteristic confidence. But as my expertise in business turnarounds grew, I became increasingly concerned about the strategies Sarah was implementing at Morrison Industries. Her approach emphasized rapid growth and aggressive expansion, exactly the patterns I had seen lead to disaster in dozens of other companies. She was making decisions based on best-case scenarios and perfect execution, without adequate planning for the complications and setbacks that inevitably occurred in real-world business operations. During family gatherings, I listened to Sarah describe her latest projects with growing alarm. Her timeline for expanding production capacity was unrealistic. Her financial projections assumed market conditions that were unlikely to persist, and her integration plans for the Hartwell acquisition ignored operational complexities that could take years to resolve. I tried to raise concerns diplomatically, why, suggesting that maybe a more gradual approach might be safer. But my suggestions were dismissed as overly cautious thinking from someone who worked with failing companies rather than growing ones. The irony was painful because I could see exactly how Morrison Industries would fail, but my family's perception of my expertise made it impossible for me to warn them effectively. Sarah was implementing a textbook case of the aggressive growth strategies that I had seen destroy companies worth far more than Morrison Industries. But pointing that out would require explaining my track record with major corporate turnarounds, which would contradict everything my family believed about my career. I began monitoring Morrison Industries' public financial reports and industry coverage, watching the warning signs accumulate exactly as I had predicted. Their debt-to-equity ratio was climbing as they funded expansion projects. Their inventory turnover was slowing as they tried to serve too many markets simultaneously, and their profit margins were shrinking as they competed on price rather than value. The trends were subtle enough that they wouldn't alarm traditional analysis, but they represented dangerous vulnerabilities that could trigger rapid decline if market conditions changed or if a major project went wrong. The Hartwell acquisition was the decision that convinced me Morrison Industries was heading for serious trouble. Sarah had identified Hartwell as a strategic opportunity, but I knew from industry publications that Hartwell's problems were structural rather than cyclical. They had operational inefficiencies, labor relations issues, and equipment problems that would become Morrison Industries' responsibility the moment the acquisition was completed. Absorbing those problems while trying to integrate two different company cultures would strain Morrison Industries' management capacity exactly when they needed to be focused on managing their own growth challenges. I considered trying to warn Dad directly, but I knew he would view any criticism of Sarah's strategy as jealousy or second-guessing from someone who had chosen to work outside the family business. The family narrative that positioned me as the cautious one who avoided real responsibility made it impossible for me to present my concerns as expert analysis rather than uninformed criticism. I was trapped by my own reputation for playing it safe, unable to explain that my caution came from experience with exactly the type of disaster Sarah was creating. The $10 million loss that resulted from Sarah's failed contract was devastating, but not surprising to me. I had seen similar projects fail in my consulting work, usually when companies took on commitments that required perfect execution across multiple departments that hadn't worked together at that scale before. The aggressive timeline, the integration challenges from the recent acquisition, and the pressure to demonstrate Morrison Industries' expanded capabilities had created a perfect storm of risks that made failure almost inevitable. When Dad called my office that Tuesday morning, his voice carried a tone I had never heard before. The man who had always spoken with complete confidence about business decisions now sounded uncertain and almost fragile. He asked if I had time to discuss a consulting opportunity, using the formal language he employed with business associates rather than the casual tone he used with family. I knew immediately that this wasn't a routine request, and that Morrison Industries' problems had reached the point where Dad was willing to seek help from sources he had previously dismissed. I agreed to meet that afternoon, and spent the morning preparing for a conversation that would either bridge the gap between my professional success and family recognition or confirm that the divide was unbridgeable. I reviewed Morrison Industries' recent financial reports, gathered information about their industry challenges, and mentally prepared strategies that might help them recover from the crisis that Sarah's aggressive growth had created. Dad arrived at my office building precisely on time, and I met him in the lobby to escort him upstairs. He looked around the modern office tower with obvious surprise, taking in the marble floors, expensive artwork, and the general atmosphere of corporate success that surrounded us. During the elevator ride, he commented that he hadn't realized my consulting firm occupied such impressive space, and I explained that we had moved to this building 2 years earlier to accommodate our growing client base and expanded staff. When we entered my office, Dad stopped in the doorway and stared at the space I had created. The corner office overlooked the city from 42 floors up, with floor-to-ceiling windows that filled the room with natural light. The walls were lined with bookcases containing business texts and industry analyses, interspersed with awards and testimonials from companies I had helped turn around. My desk, a massive piece of mahogany that commanded the room, was covered with case studies and financial reports from current projects. But what seemed to shock Dad most were the framed photographs and letters from clients, displaying gratitude from business owners whose companies I had saved from bankruptcy, letters from employees thanking me for preserving their jobs, and industry awards recognizing my contributions to corporate turnaround strategies. He spent several minutes examining these testimonials, reading the names of companies and organizations that he clearly recognized and respected. I offered him a seat in one of the leather chairs facing my desk and poured coffee from the service that my assistant had prepared. The silence stretched between us as Dad continued to absorb the evidence of a professional life that bore no resemblance to his understanding of my career. Finally, He looked directly at me and said that he needed to admit he had seriously underestimated what I had accomplished, and that he was hoping I might be willing to help Morrison Industries navigate the most serious crisis in the company's history. The conversation that followed was unlike any we had ever had, with Dad speaking to me as an expert whose opinion he valued rather than as his child whose caution had always frustrated him. He described the $10 million loss in detail, explaining how Sarah's attempt to demonstrate Morrison Industries' expanded capabilities had exposed weaknesses in their operations that threatened the company's financial stability. The bank was demanding immediate action to address their deteriorating debt position, and Dad was struggling to develop a recovery strategy that would satisfy their lending partners while preserving the jobs and relationships that had taken decades to build. As Dad spoke, I could see him processing the disconnect between his previous understanding of my work and the reality of the expertise he was now seeking. He asked about my experience with similar situations, and I described several cases where I had helped companies recover from failed expansion strategies and operational integration problems. I explained the frameworks I had developed for analyzing complex business problems and implementing solutions that addressed both immediate financial pressures and long-term operational sustainability. Dad listened with the focused attention of someone who had finally found hope after months of watching problems multiply faster than solutions could be implemented. He asked detailed questions about my turnaround strategies, and I could see his respect growing as I demonstrated knowledge of business challenges that went far beyond anything he had expected from me. The conversation lasted for over 2 hours, during which the relationship between us shifted fundamentally as he began to understand that the child he had seen as playing it safe was actually an expert in exactly the type of crisis that Morrison Industries was facing. When our meeting ended, Dad asked if I would be willing to accept Morrison Industries as a client, and I told him that I would need to analyze their situation thoroughly before making any commitments. I explained that corporate turnarounds required complete honesty about problems and total commitment to implementing solutions, even when those solutions required admitting that previous strategies had been wrong. Dad assured me that he was prepared for whatever difficult truths my analysis might reveal, and that Morrison Industries' survival was more important than anyone's ego or reputation. We agreed that I would spend the following week conducting a comprehensive review of Morrison Industries' operations, finances, and strategic position, after which I would present my assessment and recommendations. Dad thanked me with obvious emotion, explaining that he had been struggling with the weight of potentially losing everything he had built, and that our conversation had given him hope that Morrison Industries might survive the current crisis. After Dad left, I sat in my office and reflected on the strange journey that had brought us to this moment. For years, I had been helping other families save their businesses while watching my own family make decisions that I knew would lead to exactly the type of crisis they were now facing. The vindication of finally being recognized as an expert was satisfying, but it was overshadowed by sadness that it had taken disaster to bridge the gap between my professional success and family acceptance. The following Monday, I arrived at Morrison Industries headquarters for the first time in over 5 years. The building looked exactly as I remembered from my summer internship, but walking through the lobby as a consultant rather than as the boss's son created a completely different perspective on the place where my family's legacy lived. Employees who had known me since childhood greeted me with curiosity and respect, word having spread quickly that Dad had brought in outside expertise to help address the company's problems. Sarah met me in the conference room where I would be conducting interviews and reviewing documents, and the interaction was awkward for both of us. She was clearly struggling with the role reversal that had made her younger sibling the expert whose analysis would determine her company's future, while I was trying to balance my professional obligations with the family relationships that complicated every aspect of this engagement. We both understood that my assessment would either validate her leadership decisions or expose them as the cause of Morrison Industries' problems. Over the course of that week, I interviewed every department head, reviewed 5 years of financial records, analyzed operational data from both Morrison Industries and the recently acquired Hartwell facilities, and conducted a thorough assessment of their competitive position in changing markets. The picture that emerged was exactly what I had feared: a company that had grown beyond its management capacity while taking on debt and operational complexity that made them vulnerable to exactly the type of crisis they were now experiencing. By Friday afternoon, I had completed my analysis and was preparing the presentation that would either save Morrison Industries or confirm that they were beyond rescue. The data told a clear story of aggressive expansion that had ignored operational realities, but I had also identified strategies that could stabilize their situation if they were willing to make fundamental changes to their approach. The question was whether Dad and Sarah would accept recommendation. An S that required admitting their recent strategies had been wrong, and whether they could implement changes quickly enough to satisfy their banking partners and restore operational stability. The boardroom at Morrison Industries had hosted countless important meetings over the decades, but none quite like the one scheduled for Monday morning when I would present my findings to Dad, Sarah, and the senior leadership team. I arrived early to set up my presentation materials, arranging style charts and operational analyses across the mahogany table where my family had made decisions that shaped 3 generations of workers and their families. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was finally taking my place at this table not as the heir who had been passed over, but as the expert who might save everything. Dad and Sarah entered together, their body language revealing the tension that had characterized their relationship since the $10 million loss. Behind them came the department heads I had interviewed throughout the week, men and women who had built their careers at Morrison Industries and now faced the possibility that their company might not survive its current crisis. The weight of their collective anxiety filled the room as everyone took their seats, understanding that the next few hours would determine whether Morrison Industries had a viable future. I began my presentation by acknowledging the courage it had taken for Dad to seek outside help, explaining that many family business owners would rather risk everything than admit they needed expertise they didn't possess internally. The comment was directed at Dad, but I could see Sarah absorbing the implication that recognizing the need for help was a sign of strength rather than weakness. She sat perfectly still, her hands folded on the table, preparing to hear an analysis that would either vindicate her leadership decisions or expose them as the cause of Morrison Industries' problems. The financial analysis came first, and I walked through 5 years of data that told the story of a company that had grown beyond its operational capacity while accumulating debt that made them vulnerable to exactly the type of crisis they were now experiencing. I showed how Morrison Industries' debt-to-equity ratio had climbed steadily as they funded expansion projects, how their inventory turnover had slowed as they tried to serve too many markets simultaneously, and how their profit margins had eroded as they competed on price rather than value. Sarah's face grew pale as I presented Chart AF. To chart demonstrating that the warning signs of financial trouble had been building for years, accelerating dramatically after the Hartwell acquisition. The data made it clear that the $10 million loss wasn't an isolated incident, but rather the inevitable result of strategic decisions that had prioritized growth over stability. Every person in the room could see that Morrison Industries had been heading toward crisis long before the failed contract that had triggered their current emergency. But I didn't stop with financial analysis, because numbers alone wouldn't save Morrison Industries. I presented operational data showing how the aggressive expansion had strained management systems that hadn't been designed to handle the complexity of multiple facilities, diverse product lines, and the integration challenges that came with acquiring struggling competitors. The Hartwell acquisition had multiplied these problems exponentially, adding operational inefficiencies and cultural conflicts that were consuming management attention and financial resources. Dad asked pointed questions about specific decisions, and I could see him beginning to understand how strategies that had seemed reasonable in isolation had combined to create systemic vulnerabilities. Sarah remained silent, but her expression revealed that she was processing the reality that her bold leadership initiatives had actually weakened the company she had been trying to strengthen. The department heads exchanged glances that confirmed they had recognized many of these problems but hadn't felt empowered to challenge strategic decisions made at the executive level. When I finished presenting the problems, the room fell silent as everyone absorbed the magnitude of the challenges Morrison Industries faced. Dad was the first to speak, asking whether I believed the company could be saved or if they were past the point of recovery. His voice carried the weight of a lifetime spent building something that might be destroyed by decisions made with the best of intentions, but without adequate understanding of their consequences. I explained that Morrison Industries could be saved, but only if they were willing to make fundamental changes to their strategy and operations. The recovery plan I had developed would require them to abandon the aggressive growth model that had created their problems and focus instead on stabilizing operations while rebuilding financial strength. It meant selling assets they had recently acquired, reducing production capacity they had fought to expand, and essentially admitting that their recent strategic direction had been wrong. The specific recommendations were painful but necessary. Morrison Industries would need to divest the Hartwell facilities, focusing their resources on optimizing their original operations rather than trying to manage multiple locations with different systems and cultures. They would need to reduce their product lines, concentrating on the markets where they had genuine competitive advantages rather than trying to serve every opportunity that presented itself. Most importantly, they would need to restructure their debt and rebuild their cash reserves before attempting any new growth initiatives. Sarah finally spoke, asking how long it would take to implement these changes and whether Morrison Industries would be competitive after scaling back so dramatically. I could hear the pain in her voice as she contemplated unwinding years of work and admitting that her vision for the company's future had been fundamentally flawed. But I could also hear the intelligence and determination that had made her successful, and I realized that she was already beginning to think about how to execute a recovery strategy rather than simply defending past decisions. I explained that the turnaround would take 18 to 24 months, during which Morrison Industries would need to focus entirely on operational excellence and financial stability. The company that emerged from this process would be smaller than what Sarah had envisioned, but it would also be more profitable, more stable, and better positioned for sustainable growth when market conditions improved. The choice was between accepting these limitations or risking total failure within the next 12 months. Dad asked about my role in implementing these recommendations, and I explained that successful turnarounds required consistent leadership from someone who understood both the strategic framework and the operational details of the recovery process. Morrison Industries would need a chief restructuring officer who could work full-time on coordination between departments, monitoring progress against financial targets, and making the difficult decisions that would inevitably arise during implementation. The implication was clear. They needed me to guide Morrison Industries through the most challenging period in the company's history. Dad looked at Sarah, who nodded slowly, understanding that her pride was less important than the survival of the company and the jobs of everyone who depended on Morrison Industries for their livelihoods. She asked whether I would be willing to take on that responsibility, and I could see the effort it took for her to request help from the sibling she had always seen as less capable than herself. I agreed to serve as Morrison Industries' chief restructuring officer, with the understanding that my recommendations would be implemented completely and without compromise. The recovery plan was based on proven strategies that I had used in similar situations, but it would only work if everyone committed to following through on difficult decisions, even when they seemed to contradict everything the company had been trying to accomplish. Dad assured me that I would have whatever authority was necessary to make the changes Morrison Industries needed to survive. The meeting concluded with assignments for each department head, specific timelines for implementing various aspects of the recovery plan, and a communication strategy for explaining the changes to employees, customers, and financial partners. Sarah would remain as president, but would focus on operational execution rather than strategic planning, while I would handle the restructuring process and work directly with their banking partners to negotiate new terms that would give Morrison Industries time to recover. As people filed out of the boardroom, Sarah remained behind to speak with me privately. She apologized for years of dismissing my opinions and acknowledged that I had tried to warn the family about problems she was too confident to recognize. The conversation was difficult for both of us, but it marked the beginning of a new relationship based on mutual respect rather than childhood perceptions that no longer reflected our actual capabilities. The implementation phase began immediately, with Morrison Industries announcing the strategic restructuring to employees, customers, and industry partners. The local business press covered the story extensively, noting that Morrison Industries had brought in a turnaround specialist to guide their recovery, but not initially identifying me as a family member. The anonymity was helpful during the early stages, as it allowed me to make difficult decisions without the complications that would have come with public attention to the family dynamics involved. The Hartwell divestiture was completed within 6 weeks, with Morrison Industries selling the facilities to a regional competitor who had the management capacity to address the operational problems that had made the acquisition unsuccessful. The sale price was significantly less than Morrison Industries had paid, but it eliminated ongoing losses and allowed management to focus entirely on optimizing their core operations. Reducing the product lines was more complex, requiring detailed analysis of profitability by market segment and careful communication with customers whose business would no longer be pursued. Some long-standing relationships were ended, but the customers Morrison Industries retained received better service and more competitive pricing as resources were concentrated on markets where the company had genuine advantages. The debt restructuring negotiations were the most challenging aspect of the recovery process, requiring me to present detailed financial projections to banking partners who had lost confidence in Morrison Industries' management capabilities. My track record with other corporate turnarounds provided credibility that helped convince lenders to modify their terms, but the negotiations still required Morrison Industries to accept higher interest rates and more restrictive covenants that would limit their financial flexibility during the recovery period. Within 6 months, Morrison Industries' financial performance began to improve dramatically. The elimination of UNP. Profitable operations increased their margins, the focus on core markets improved customer satisfaction, and the reduced complexity allowed management to identify and address inefficiencies that had been hidden by the chaos of trying to manage too many different initiatives simultaneously. The transformation was noticed by industry analysts, who began writing positive articles about Morrison Industries' disciplined approach to recovery and their improved competitive position in their core markets. The coverage mentioned that the company had brought in expert guidance to manage their restructuring, and gradually my role became public knowledge as reporters researched the story behind Morrison Industries' remarkable turnaround. When Business Weekly published a feature article about family businesses that had successfully navigated major crises, Morrison Industries was prominently featured, with detailed coverage of how they had recovered from near bankruptcy through strategic focus and operational discipline. The article identified me as both the chief restructuring officer and a member of the Morrison family, making it clear that Dad had sought help from a son whose expertise he had previously underestimated. The publication of that article changed the family dynamic in ways that went far beyond business relationships. Extended family members who had watched my career with polite disinterest suddenly wanted to understand how I had developed the expertise that had saved Morrison Industries. Industry colleagues began reaching out to congratulate Dad on having the wisdom to recognize and utilize the talent within his own family, rather than allowing pride to prevent him from accepting help when it was needed most. Sarah's leadership style evolved significantly during the recovery process, as she learned to value operational excellence and systematic analysis over bold gestures and aggressive timelines. She became one of my most effective collaborators, using her knowledge of Morrison Industries' culture and relationships to implement changes in ways that preserved employee morale and customer loyalty. The experience of working together to save the company created a professional partnership that neither of us had thought possible during our childhood years of competing for Dad's attention. The success of Morrison Industries' turnaround enhanced my reputation in the consulting world, as word spread about the family business consultant who had saved his own family's company from bankruptcy. New clients began seeking my services specifically because of my experience navigating the complex emotions and relationships that complicated business decisions in family-controlled enterprises. My consulting practice expanded to focus almost exclusively on family business turnarounds, a specialization that allowed me to command premium fees while working on the most challenging and rewarding cases in the industry. But the most meaningful change was in my relationship with Dad, who began including me in strategic discussions not because I was his son, but because my analysis had proven valuable in understanding complex business challenges. He started asking for my opinion on industry trends, competitive threats, and investment opportunities, treating me as a trusted advisor whose perspective he valued. The conversations we had been unable to have for years became natural and frequent, building the professional relationship that had always been missing from our family dynamic. 18 months after Morrison Industries had faced potential bankruptcy, the company was not only stable, but thriving within their focused market segments. Their debt had been reduced to manageable levels, their operations were running more efficiently than they had in years, and their financial performance was strong enough that they were beginning to consider carefully planned growth initiatives that would build on their operational strengths rather than stretching beyond their management capacity. The annual shareholders' meeting that year was a celebration of Morrison Industries' recovery and a testament to the power of recognizing problems early and addressing them systematically. Sarah presented the operational improvements that had been implemented, while I discussed the financial restructuring that had provided stability during the recovery period. Dad spoke about the lessons he had learned about the importance of seeking expertise when facing challenges beyond their previous experience, and the value of recognizing talent regardless of where it came from. The local business community took notice of Morrison Industries' remarkable turnaround, and I was invited to speak at industry conferences about family business succession planning and crisis management. The speaking opportunities led to consulting engagements with other family businesses facing similar challenges, creating a steady stream of work that combined my expertise in corporate turnarounds with the specialized knowledge of family dynamics that I had gained through saving my own family's company. The irony of becoming recognized as an expert in family business consulting wasn't lost on me, given that my own family had taken years to recognize my business expertise. But the experience had taught me that perception and reality often diverge in family relationships, and that proving your worth sometimes requires accepting opportunities to demonstrate capabilities that others have overlooked. The key was maintaining professionalism and dignity throughout the process, focusing on results rather than vindication. 2 years after the crisis that had brought me back to Morrison Industries, I stepped down as Chief Restructuring Officer and returned to my consulting practice full-time. Sarah H. had proven herself capable of leading the company's ongoing operations. Dad had regained confidence in Morrison Industries' future, and the systems we had implemented during the recovery were functioning smoothly without requiring my daily oversight. The transition was celebrated at a family dinner that felt completely different from the tense gatherings that had characterized our relationships during the crisis period. Sarah spoke about what she had learned from working with me. Dad acknowledged the expertise that had saved Morrison Industries, and the conversation flowed naturally between business topics and family news. For the first time in years, I felt like I belonged at the family table not despite my career choices, but because of them. The success of Morrison Industries' turnaround became a case study that I used in presentations and articles about family business management, always with my family's permission and always emphasizing the lessons learned rather than the personal vindication involved. The story resonated with audience CES because it illustrated universal themes about family relationships, professional recognition, and the importance of setting aside ego when facing genuine crisis. My consulting practice continued to grow, specializing in family businesses that needed both operational expertise and guidance in managing the emotional complexities that affected business decisions. Each case was different, but the fundamental principles remained consistent: honest analysis of problems, systematic implementation of solutions, and maintaining dignity throughout the process regardless of personal relationships or past misunderstandings. The relationship with my family evolved into something healthier and more balanced than it had ever been before. Sarah and I developed a professional friendship based on mutual respect for each other's capabilities. Dad began treating me as an equal partner in family business discussions, and holiday gatherings became opportunities to share professional experiences rather than endure subtle comparisons between different life choices. Looking back on that Monday morning when I stood in Morrison Industries' boardroom preparing to present analysis that would either save or doom my family's company, I realized that the moment of vindication I had long imagined was less important than the relationships and understanding that grew from the crisis. Being right about the problems Morrison Industries faced was satisfying, but being able to help solve those problems was profoundly meaningful in ways that personal validation could never match. The quiet strength that I had developed through years of helping other families save their businesses had prepared me for the moment when my own family needed exactly the expertise they had previously dismissed. The vindication came not from proving them wrong, but from demonstrating that my careful, analytical approach to business challenges could deliver results when dramatic gestures and aggressive strategies had failed. Today, Morrison Industries continues to thrive under Sarah's leadership, operating with the disciplined approach to growth and systematic attention to operational excellence that we implemented during the recovery period. Dad remains active as chairman, providing strategic guidance while trusting the management team to handle day-to-day operations. The company has become a model for successful family business management, demonstrating that professional expertise and family relationships can complement each other when everyone focuses on serving the greater good rather than protecting individual egos. My consulting practice has become one of the most respected family business advisory services in the country, built on a foundation of proven results and deep understanding of the unique challenges that arise when business and family relationships intersect. The success gives me satisfaction, but real reward comes from helping families preserve businesses that represent generations of work and provide livelihoods for communities that depend on their continued success. The story of Morrison Industries' near collapse and recovery serves as a reminder that expertise can come from unexpected sources, that family relationships can evolve when people are willing to see each other clearly, and that sometimes the greatest vindication comes not from being proven right, but from being given the opportunity to help solve problems that matter to people you love. In quiet moments, I sometimes reflect on how different things might have been if Dad had recognized my expertise earlier, or if Sarah had been more open to different perspectives on business strategy. But those alternate histories matter less than the reality we created together, working through crisis to build stronger relationships and a more sustainable business that honors the past while preparing for the future. The greatest victory wasn't proving that I had been right about the risks Morrison Industries was taking, but rather demonstrating that quiet strength and systematic analysis could achieve results that dramatic gestures and bold confidence couldn't deliver. The vindication was complete not when my family finally acknowledged my expertise, but when that expertise was used to preserve something precious that we all valued more than individual recognition or personal pride.